Hello, I'm 5th District Supervisor Joe Baca Jr. We're here today to spotlight one of our local heroes and advocates in our community, Ryan Tillman. And just to give you a little bit of background of Ryan Tillman, he was raised in Rialto, California, graduated from Rialto High School, attended UNLV, and then became a law enforcement officer with the Chino Police Department and runs an organization called Breaking Barriers United. Good to be here. So Ryan, tell us a little bit about your upbringing in Rialto.
Man, I owe a lot to Rialto. Rialto has made me the man I am today for many reasons. They often say it takes a village to raise a child. And there were so many people in that village, you included, my dad, Anthony Brown, Coach Harper, that raised me to the man I am today. And it taught me grit. It taught me how to overcome adversity. And I learned all that through playing sports and going to school at Rialto and Jehu Middle School. And so everywhere I travel now, I travel a lot now to speak, and I always talk about Rialto because Rialto is what made me.
Oh, that's great. We appreciate that you're proud of where you come from. But you graduated from college. What made you decide to go into public service, become a law enforcement officer?
That's a great question. So I had no aspirations of being a police officer whatsoever. When I'm in college, I'm playing football, and at the time, I was going to go out there and be a Fortune 500 CEO. That was my dream. And I graduated from there. My dad had got sick with MS. And so I had met my wife at the time, my girlfriend at the time, now wife now. I met her and I moved back home because she was from Ontario. So I said, let me move home, help take care of my dad. And at the time I was working at Abercrombie & Fitch and I hated it. It was all the cologne and perfume we sprayed, and then I was selling insurance. And I was like, man, we had got married and my wife got pregnant with our first child. And at that moment in time, I was like, man, I need to get a real job. And so my dad's friend worked for Ontario Police Department, and he was like, Ryan, you'd be a great police officer. And I was like, absolutely not. I said, I don't want to work for the man. I'm not about to be, one of those guys, because that was always my mentality of officers. And after praying about it, I just asked God, I said, God, what do you want me to do? And I said, God, if this is what you want me to do, open the door. If it's not, close the door. And that's kind of when the doors just flew open. And I found myself in the hiring process with multiple agencies and got picked up with Chino Police Department in 2013, and the rest was history. And so once I got into law enforcement, I got to understand my purpose, and my purpose was to go out there and bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. As a black male, working in a profession where our community doesn't necessarily like police officers, I now had a unique picture and vantage point that most people didn't have. I got to see what we do, why we do, and how we do it, but I also could still connect to my own community, and that's kind of what forged Breaking Barriers United.
Oh, that's great. So that kind of segues into Breaking Barriers United. Tell the community a little bit about what your purpose is of this organization that you're trying to do. What are you trying to accomplish from this? Because the thing I've noticed is you've got a lot of national attention from it. You've gotten a lot of exposure from it. So tell the community about what Breaking Barriers United is and what's their goal.
Breaking Barriers United was forged simply to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. And what started out as just, hey, I want to go out there and change the perception of the way people view law enforcement has really evolved into something that I can't even comprehend now. I mean, we consult all over the country now for organizations like Faith Fight Finish, which is Dak Prescott's nonprofit organization, Just Keep Living Foundation, with his Matthew McConaughey's foundation. We're doing work in schools to help combat bullying and drug addiction or drug overdoses, and still changing the perception of law enforcement. Sure. So I think what I pride myself on is really allowing people to see the human behind the badge. No doubt about it, there have been some bad police officers, no doubt. But you look in any profession, you're always going to have bad in it, whether Sure. it be politics, whether it be education, whether it be schooling, or law, whatever it is, you're always going to have bad. And so my goal is I want to go out there and change the perception of law enforcement. And we've done that through numerous ways. We have social media where I do breakdowns and I tell people exactly what happened in a situation. A lot of times people will watch these polarizing events that involve law enforcement and they start to form opinions based on what they see on social media. So what I start to do is I start to do a breakdown and tell people exactly what happened and why it happened. Then we recently launched something called Switch, where we switch the roles of law enforcement and community. So we put vest on community members. We give them semi-munition round guns, and they hurt if you get hit.
Sure.
And we basically recreate real events. And in the most recent project we're working on, which is a Ryan Tillman show, is where we tell the stories of actual police officers that have been involved in critical incidents. So recently we had one of San Bernardino's own, Megan McCarthy, on our show, who had her gun taken from her a few years ago. We're also going to highlight Alex Collins, who was shot by Christopher Dorner on Monday. And then we're going to be highlighting one of the officers that was involved in the Vegas shooting. So our goal is just to tell stories. And when you tell stories, people oftentimes see the human behind it.
No, I appreciate you sharing that, because I've got a chance to watch some of your Instagram posts, and you highlight and you go through scenarios of incidents that have national attention, not just local, and I think you kind of bring a lot to light. One of the things you mentioned is putting others in the position of being a law enforcement officer. I've gone through simulated trainings where you're holding a gun, they give you scenarios, and I think the public doesn't realize that things can switch like that. Maybe you can kind of explain to the public from the law enforcement side how a situation you walk into may be low impact and all of a sudden it flips on, and maybe you can share with the public that.
100%. I just did a video recently of a girl who was on patrol and she responded to a disturbance. And as soon as she gets out of her car, the guy rushes her with a hammer and starts to attack her. And what I did was I timed it. And I wanted to time it from the time she got out of her car to the time she actually found herself on the ground, and it was 10 seconds. Now, some people may say, oh, 10 seconds is a long time, but 10 seconds is a very, very short time. I recently did another breakdown of a video, and it was 3 seconds. And so what the community is asking officers to do is make life-altering decisions in less than seconds. It's a very, very difficult thing to do. It's a thing that I didn't understand quite well before I became an officer. I always assumed when I sat on the couch and I was like, oh, they could have did this, they could have did that. But now that I'm inside of it, it's completely different. And I always go back to my time as a quarterback at Rialto High School. And I remember being the quarterback of the football team, and we'd be out there Friday Night Lights, and everybody's watching you. And when I was out there running the field, there were things that I saw that nobody else saw. And I remember after the game, if we would lose, people would critique me and say, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you throw it to the guy in the flats? Why didn't you go here? And I'm like, you didn't see what I saw. And so the whole idea of Monday morning quarterbacking is a real thing. It's like, unless you're in it, you can't necessarily say what you would or wouldn't have done, because everybody's going to respond differently in those situations.
No, you bring up a good point. And until people are put into those scenarios, they don't know how they would react. And it's easy to be a critic when you're on the sidelines, but like you said, when you're actually in the heat of the moment and dealing with those situations, it's very, very difficult. Let's go back to your upbringing. I know you mentioned some of your coaches, but I know that your uncle was on the San Bernardino City Unified School District, which still is. Your father was on the West Valley Water District. How did those public service influences of your father and uncle, maybe those around you, really influence your upbringing?
Yeah, so I always like to say I'm an extension of my family, particularly my father. My dad was on the water board, the president of the water board for many years. He ran for city council. My uncle, like you said, has been on school board. And I always got to see public service firsthand. I always got to see what it was like to serve others and put other people's needs before yourself. And so as an adult now, being 36 years old, it's always kind of been ingrained in me. And then also I'm a believer in Christ. And so, he was also he was the ultimate servant. So I think that's all kind of played into who I am and shaped me. But also it makes me want to lead by a good example. And so I find myself leading by example to my kids, my wife, to the community at large. And even, again, going back to law enforcement, one of the things I want to highlight too is, although I've been able to change perceptions, I also have been one thing that I guess would separate me from a lot of other people is I've called out law enforcement. And it's been very controversial in many ways, because in order to forge bonds and bridge that gap and break barriers, you also have to be able to acknowledge wrong. And so I've been one of those guys that have acknowledged wrongdoing in law enforcement. I just did a video the other day that's about to come out where officers released a canine on somebody and they shouldn't have. That's something that we have to own up. And I think historically in our profession, we've had a hard time doing that. And so I think that's why there's a lot of grief in between the public and community.
Sure, we appreciate you sharing your family background, your faith, and just, trying to be honest with the public. And I think that's important. You're not trying to take sides, one or another. You try to look at things objectively, and we appreciate that. So you're now an author. Tell us about your book, and what is your intent of the book? What are you trying to accomplish, your message trying to get out in your book?
Absolutely. So Happy Eyes, Becoming All Things to All People. The concept was simple. So the name of it comes from my wife, actually. When I first met my wife, I remember seeing a text message from her. She was talking to her friend, and she was like, oh yeah, I'm hanging out with Happy Eyes. I was like, who the heck is Happy Eyes? You got somebody else already? We just dating? And she said, laughed. She was like, "You're Happy Eyes, silly." And I was like, "Well, why do you call me Happy Eyes?" She said, "Because every time you talk, without even smiling, your eyes smile." And I realized that I was blessed with this ability to see the best in everything, despite your circumstance. And so I really adapted those philosophies, and I wanted to write a book of how do you see the best in everybody despite who you are without necessarily having to compromise who you are. Unfortunately, we live in a time period where you're either left or you're right. You're either pro law enforcement, not law enforcement. And if you don't agree with me, then we can't be friends, we can't hang out. And I kind of see the world differently. I think one of the greatest things about our country is that we can be different, but still have relationships with one another and still be able to not have to necessarily compromise on certain things. So I wrote a book on that, is how do you see the best of people? And the way you do it is you have to lead with love, you have to lead with empathy, and you have to lead with respect. Love covers a multitude of sins. Empathy, you don't necessarily have to have the same experience. All you have to do is have a similar emotion. And then respect. Respect is won and lost, whether you give it or not. And so I think that's why I wrote the book. And it was awesome. I got to have Dak Prescott write the foreword of my book.
That's great.
So he's become a good friend of mine in the recent years.
Do you do the Dak dance?
It's funny. So I did a class with him, and we did an e-learning class for officers. Right. And starting that class, I said, "Some of you guys may recognize me from this dance. No, not this one." And I showed Dak's dance, and then I put my dancing video up next to it. But yeah, it's funny. We connect on so many different levels.
That's great. No, I know that your book is called Happy Eyes, and I think that's great. I would actually call it Old Eyes, because I think you're trying to look through the lens of, a little old school, back to the old core values in our country: respect, honor, dignity, respecting one another, accepting someone's differences. We're all different, and I think that's important. It's like, it's not one or the other, not black and white. Everything we do in our country is not clear cut. And I think that's important that you push that out in your book. Now, as we wrap things up, Ryan, I just want to thank you for your time, but what would be the lasting message you would like to leave with the community?
So I think two things. Number one is try to see the best in everybody. It sounds like an easy thing, but it's really not that easy. I call it, I refer to it in the book as, you have to get out of the vortex. So I want you to do an activity. I want you to pull up your phone, and I want you to go on Instagram or TikTok, wherever you spend most of your time. And I want you to start to look through your followers, or not your followers, the people you're following. And if you see a common trend of the people you follow, that means you have to go and find other people that may not be like you, that may not say the things that you want to say. Because what happens is we live in a world now where social media is designed now to feed you your likes and interests. And the more and more you get sucked in that vortex, the more and more you're going to see differences in other people. But if you continue to open up your vortex and let other people in that may not have the same ideals that you do, then it's going to make you be more of a well-rounded individual, and you can contribute more to your community. The last thing is, I'll say this, is we're about to get ready to go into election season. And election season, it gets crazy. And I was listening to an interview with somebody recently who, he's always identified with one political party, but he said something that really stuck out to me. He said, I remember back in the day, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, we had our differences, but we all wanted to move the pendulum going in the same direction. So even though we had differences of how we did it, we all wanted to move in the same direction. And he says, nowadays it feels like it's all more so about highlighting the different flaws of the other without actually seeing the benefits of moving the community forward. So I think one last thing I would like to leave people with is, how do we get that ball moving in the same direction again? How do we work together? And how do we utilize each other's differences in order to push that ball forward, as opposed to pointing fingers? Because when we start to point fingers at each other, the ball doesn't roll anywhere.
No, you bring up a good point, personal responsibility. Take responsibility for our actions, not chop down others. I believe that as humans, we have an opportunity to learn from one another. We may not agree, may disagree, but I think it's a good opportunity to learn. But we appreciate your approach to life, your approach to the community, and how you really want to make a big difference. And for me personally, as your former teacher at Rialto High School, I am so proud of you.
Oh, thanks.
I'm proud of you and all the boys that you had. We all, you all went to school together, and I still remember the time I got to go to UNLV and watch you play. Your dad gave me tickets. That was many years ago, but just
Campus
proud.
life.
Yeah, campus life. But just on behalf of the 5th District, we want to say we're very proud of Ryan and all the accomplishments he did as a Rialto resident. Now moved on with Chino PD, and most of all with Breaking Barriers United. I want to thank all of you for tuning in, and please listen to the great words of Ryan Tillman and get his book, Happy Eyes. So thank you for tuning in.
Thank you so much.